All right, so I will get started then. Thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate you all coming to my presentation. It's good to see some of the names too. I know some of you I haven't talked to for a while, but it's really nice to see your names. It's been definitely lonely here for sure. So what I'm presenting today is just an introduction to theater music. So living in the Northeast where it's very common, if you're an educator or any musician in the area, there's probably a 99.99% chance that you'll be asked to play in a musical by the time you're done your music path. So if you get asked to do one, this is kind of like just a general way to understand what you're getting yourself into when you get asked to do one, because there's kind of a lot of different steps to it. But I've been playing in musicals and theater groups throughout the southern New Hampshire area. I've been doing it for probably 5 or 6 years now, and it's probably by far my favorite music gig that I do. It's a lot of fun, and each show is different and super exciting. So hopefully this will get you kind of excited if you get asked to do one. So what is a Broadway Pit Orchestra? So what a lot of people don't know is that orchestra is not a term for like a group. It's technically a section of the theater. So the orchestra is down around the stage and below. So like when you see your stereotypical like orchestras for opera and things like that, they're kind of in front of the stage and underneath the stage. That's the orchestra. So the term orchestra is not from, you think of like an orchestra playing a symphony. It's actually a term from where the musicians sit. So the pit orchestra are the live musicians that play the music for Broadway musicals. Each show on Broadway, and for the most part, are live musicians. Sometimes you'll have tracks if it's a low budget, but for the most part, it's real musicians in a full band. And so these shows are really, really common around the Northeast. As you know, Broadway is about 4 hours from us. So that's where the hub of all of these shows are. And in Boston too, it's really popular. A lot of touring groups come in. And so the shows are for all age groups. So I've done shows from little kids that are barely in middle school, and I've done shows with complete full adult casts. So the shows vary in range. There's not just one age group. There's all types of age groups. And so local independent theater groups perform these. So it's similar to like some ensemble groups, like you think about local orchestras and regional orchestras and things like that. It's a theater organization that puts it on. So there's lots of different groups. It's not just one organization that does it, or just high schools or anything like that. So most musicals contain about 25 to 30 songs. So this is kind of what surprised me when I first did my first musical, was just how many songs are in a musical. So each show varies in length from 2 hours to up to 3.5 hours. When I did Beauty and the Beast, the show I think was pushing 3 hours and 20 minutes. So it really depends on which show. Just know throughout this presentation that each show is completely different. And that's actually the really fun part, is that each show is a completely different experience. And so if you ever get asked to do a junior show, that's usually a reduced orchestra and simpler and shorter show. Some shows, like for example, Into the Woods, their junior version is just the first act. They take out some of the extra songs. There's a lot fewer numbers in it. And so the junior shows are usually easier and the music is reduced quite a bit. So what are the instruments? So again, as I'll probably say throughout this, each orchestra is completely different in how it's orchestrated. Each show has a completely different sound. So this is kind of just the general numbers or the general instruments and kind of what to expect. So keyboards, there's usually 2 keyboard players per pit. There's usually a keyboard 1 and a keyboard 2. Keyboard 1 is usually mostly piano, mostly some of the lead music, and keyboard 2 is mostly synthesizer that uses main stage and RMS keyboards. I'll get into that in a couple minutes. And then so guitar, usually only one guitarist. Some shows have 2 guitarists. be prepared with acoustic and electric. It's mostly notation and chords. So most shows are not going to have tab. It's usually notation. So guitarists, just know if you do pits that your note reading is going to have to be, it's going to have to be there. It's usually not tabs. And bass is the same deal. I meant to put chords and notation too. So bass is written notation too, no tab. So just kind of be aware of that. And so drums, and actually with bass too, depending on the shows, it really depends on the orchestration. You might be playing upright, you might be playing electric bass. It's usually electric bass for most of these shows. And it really just depends on the show. Like for example, like if you were to do Phantom of the Opera, that's mostly string instruments, with some electronics kind of built in, where if you were to do Wicked, that's a lot more like contemporary instruments. You're going to have a lot more keyboards. You're going to have a lot more synthesizers, a lot more electric guitar, things like that, where a lot of the traditional shows, like I shouldn't say traditional, but shows like Phantom of the Opera, Beauty and the Beast, if you do the full orchestra for that, that's a lot more like closer to opera with full string orchestras. And so drums, usually just usual drum kit. Some shows, again, it'll be some auxiliary percussion. Most shows now, especially the modern shows, will have one drummer and one auxiliary percussionist. And so reeds, be prepared to double. If you've been a reed player so far, you've probably learned that you got to learn more than one reed instrument. The reed books, you could be playing up to 5 or 6 different reed instruments. Some books will be like just flute. Some books will be flute, clarinet, saxophone. All the variations of like the single reeds are in the books, but usually you can work with the conductor or try and transpose some of the books, so that makes it a little bit easier. So you don't have as many instruments, but still be prepared to play probably 2 or 3 instruments if you're a reed player. In brass, usually there's no doubling. It's usually trumpet, horn, or trombone. Double reeds, usually oboe and English horn will be one book. So if you play oboe, you also should probably know how to play English horn, because most of the time those books are combined. And then bassoon is usually its own book, but bassoon is not as common, but there are bassoon books. And then violin and cello, those are important instruments. Depending on the show, some of the pits might have 1 or 2 violins, 1 or 2 cellos, because what a lot of the shows do, especially when they do national tours, is they'll reduce the size of the orchestra so there's less musicians. So that's why, for example, when I say up to 4 keyboards, when Wicked goes on tour, they have 4 keyboard players and no string players in their orchestra. So they're able to cut down on the musicians and cut down on the cost. It's a bad way. I don't think it's great to go about it that way, but that's why when you do a lot of these shows in communities, usually the books are kind of cut down a little bit from the full orchestras that are right on Broadway. So like I say on the bottom, the orchestras vary in size. Like when I do Little Shop of Horrors, it's drums, bass, guitar, and 2 keyboards. That's it. No horns or anything. So it really depends on the show. Each show is completely different in the instrumentation. I gotta go back over here. There we go. So what is the time commitment? So musicals have a lot going on. There's actors, there's lights, there's sound, and all the coordination of all the stage managers and getting all the stage setups going. There's a lot that goes on with a musical. So there's a lot of rehearsals. So when you do a musical, there's usually a week called a tech week, where you have a rehearsal every single night with everyone in the theater that you're performing it in, because the theater companies have to pay for the space. They usually don't have their own space. So that's why you usually have rehearsals at an outside space before, and then the tech week, you try and put the whole show together in a week. So it's a lot that you're trying to squeeze into one time frame. So expect probably anywhere from 2 to 5 rehearsals before tech week. As a musician, it really depends on your conductor. Back when I did it with my high school, we had a rehearsal once a week for 3 months before tech week. I've done shows before where the conductor just gives you the book and just says, see you tech week. And you show up and play the music there. So it's different depending on the conductor, depending on how difficult the music is. So it definitely varies between show to show. So these are some of the terms to know. The terms are mostly similar to what we use if you're like in a concert band or in a choir, but some of them are a little different. So this term that I still am not really sure how to pronounce, it's called a Sitzprobe, I think, but it's German, so that's probably why maybe some vocalists can help me out with that one. But that mostly just means that that's going to be a rehearsal where the pit and cast rehearse together. So usually that falls fairly close to tech week, and it's trying to coordinate the music together. And so the tech week, like I talked about, that's when you have the full rehearsal, probably every single night for probably 3 or 4 hours, running the show. And then the dress is the same as a dress rehearsal for any other ensemble. That's usually the rehearsal the night before. Usually groups will do it the same exact way they're going to do the show the following night, full makeup, full everything. So that is usually a pretty important rehearsal. And sometimes most theater groups will have a photographer come in that night and take pictures, so they're not taking pictures when it's a show night. So know that even the dress rehearsal, sometimes just know that people might be watching, or you might have pictures. So just something to kind of keep in mind. And then some terms that I have found that usually theater musicians use, but not a ton of other people use, is like, so terms like call, that's just a term for a report time. And the dress code is usually all black, but sometimes you dress in the theme with the cast. So usually you're in all black just because you're trying to kind of hide in the background a little bit. So the cast kind of stands out. And then sometimes you dress in themes with the cast. Like, for example, when I did, when I did Shrek, my whole pit wore Shrek ears. Or sometimes the actors might be on stage. I've seen shows before where people are dressed up in like 20s or 30s outfits. So the dress code changes between shows, but expect that it'll be all black. I usually wear a dress shirt, but if you just have a plain black t-shirt and black jeans, usually that's okay too. It's kind of hard to tell, but that's usually the dress code you're kind of going with when you're playing for these shows. So the setup, be prepared for any setup. I'll show you a couple of my favorite setups in the next slide. The conductor's usually in the middle, and the musicians fit where they can. Especially keyboards, it's really hard fitting the keyboards and all the power outlets and everything, getting those organized. So just know that you're going to be kind of scattered around and you might not have a lot of space. So like I just said, it depends on the instruments that require technology and then filling in where there's room. So usually reed players and some of the other instruments get scattered around a little bit. And be flexible with acoustic challenges. That's really important. This is really tough for brass players. If you're playing in a really small space, you're going to have to play quiet. And sometimes I've played where trumpets, they'll build kind of like an acoustic box almost that they play into that dampens the sound a little bit, so it's not as loud. If you want a great person to ask about that, brass players, talk to Joe Conti. Me and him play in this tiny, tiny opera house that the trumpet just cuts through, so he has to play really, really quiet. So he would be great for any tips on how to play quiet in some of these spaces. And percussion too, drum set, you're going to have to play really, really quiet depending on your show and where it is. It's just kind of how it is. Us keyboard players, we kind of get away with it a little bit because we have volume. And if you're leading a show, be prepared to help your keyboard players with the patches. I'll get into that kind of in the or in the second. And then if you're planning a musical, work with your keyboard players about main stage or RMS keyboard. So with these newer shows and with the technology, a lot of the time, the keyboard players will take a laptop like a Mac, and there's this program called Main Stage, and I'll show you an example of this. So with Main Stage, where did my doc go? There we go. So Main Stage is it's combined with Logic, and what it does is it lets you pre-program all these different voices. So the keyboard books, you'll have up to 50 or 60 different voices. So you could be strings, 2 measures later, you could be a xylophone, you can be all these crazy different things. So here's an example of, can everyone see it? I think everyone can see it.
Yes.
So see, if you look on this left side of the screen, those are all the different voices that I play. So you go through and program it. So for example, this is me when I did Elf a while back. So for the overture, I'm a string ensemble. And then as I go along, the voices change constantly. So this makes it so your keyboard player can pre-program what they're going to play. And it definitely makes things move a lot easier, because in the old days, they used to just stack like 2 or 3 keyboards and they used to play off of that. But now they've made this program, which is amazing, where you can build all these different voices. And what usually happens is, what's really cool is the keyboard player might have a pedal or the bottom 2 notes of their keyboard, and that changes the patch for them. So instead of going and clicking on their keyboard, they just press the really low B flat on their keyboard, and then that'll change the voices for them. So Main Stage, if you're a keyboard player or you plan on running a musical, it's definitely a program to consider getting. It's $30, I think, right now. So that's certainly an important program, even if you're not perfect at it, just being familiar with it. And another program that's really, really cool if you're running running a musical is RMS Keyboards. It's a little expensive depending on the show. It really depends on your musical's budget, but that's from the place that you're renting the music books from, and they pre-program everything for you. So instead of the keyboard player actually going in the Main Stage and programming, RMS Keyboards just does it all for you, and you can just kind of go and play. But RMS Keyboards usually costs around $600 or $700 for just one run of a show. So it's a little expensive, but your keyboard players are always really, really happy when they get that. So patchwork is really important to know. I could do a whole hour presentation on how to run Main Stage. So there's a lot to go with that, but just kind of be aware that patches are something that will be important with helping your keyboard players, especially during a musical. So I know this presentation already. I know I'm just kind of spitting a lot of information at you. Does anyone have any questions so far on any of this?
You're doing great, buddy.
Thanks, Grant. Any other questions? All right, I'll keep going. I can't see anyone's screen, so just talk if you have a question. So I guess I'll just keep going. So now this is an example of some of the setups I've done. So in the top left, that's kind of a normal setup where the musicians are just kind of in the front. And then if you look in the bottom left, that's where I've been in the pit, where we're up in the balcony. So that balcony's got a pretty low railing. We're all kind of squished up there. But that's a smaller room. And so that's kind of just where we fit the orchestra. So know that you could be in a ton of different setups. And then my favorite one, the one that's in the middle, we were backstage in a storage room. So if you look really close, it might be hard to see, but there's a little TV monitor in front of one of those keyboards. And that's how the conductor sees the cast. So we weren't even visible from the audience. We were backstage. And that's how we saw them. So be prepared for any setup. If you can, you probably can tell even with those, they're pretty squished. So just be prepared for any setup with these, because I think I've seen them all, and then you go to some other random place that you didn't think you would be going to. Um, so what's the music like? So each show has lots of different genres and styles within the music. This isn't true 100% of the time, but older shows tend to follow a more similar sound throughout, where the newer shows tend to have more scattered genres. So a lot more of the older shows will kind of follow a similar pattern, I guess is the best way to describe it, where some of the newer shows, especially with a lot of the keyboard programming, they'll jump to a lot of different random types of genres. Like I know in one show in Legally Blonde, there's one song where it just goes into an Irish jig randomly, and you just and it's like the shows has nothing to do with an Irish jig at all, but you just jump to a really fast Irish jig, and it's mostly like a dance feature for the actors on stage. Where shows like Little Shop of Horrors kind of follow um, the similar sound throughout, kind of the same older style. I shouldn't say older style, but they follow a similar sound. Um, and so I'll say this right now: be prepared for wacky keys. Musicals love changing keys constantly, so you've been warned up front. If you feel like you are scared of certain key signatures or changing keys, just be aware that musicals love changing keys. There's one song in Legally Blonde that has 36 key changes in one song, and they're all pretty tough ones too. So just know that if you're doing musicals, that after you do a couple of them, you will probably not be as afraid of key signatures as you were before. And no, this is kind of as a director too, if you have some younger musicians. The show is written for professional Broadway musicians, so you might have to simplify the music. Um, so especially with high school shows, like if you're doing a high school show, a lot the music is tough. A lot of it is some pretty high range, and the music is just it's overall really difficult. So um, sometimes it is good to encourage your students to um, simplify it a little bit. I wouldn't just come out and just say simplify this, but if they're having a ton of trouble with one section or it's just completely not in their range, help them just kind of come up with an alternative to simplify the music, because the music is really really tough. Um, and there's a lot of notes, and some of it too, which I've run into, isn't even possible on some instruments, because sometimes the orchestrators aren't quite like the best. I shouldn't say the best musicians, but they don't know how to play every instrument they're orchestrating. So sometimes you might even have notes that you might be able to play on your instruments, but they might just sound really bad or not be possible to play. So don't feel bad if that happens. If you're a musician in that situation, just try your best to make it seem like you're just playing the music. Um, I shouldn't say play the music that way, but just kind of get through the song without any like real noticeable mistakes. If you kind of run into that, that definitely helps. But just be prepared that you might see some music where you're like, how do you even play this on this instrument? So those are things to keep track of. So these are just some sample pages. These are just, um, this is for educational use only. Um, But even when you look at this one page, I don't know how easy it is for you to read, but you go from G flat major, E flat major, E major, all these crazy chords. It's pretty fast too. So it's things like this where if you find yourself as a keyboard player, you're really lucky if you get chords. And so sometimes just try and um, simplify it. Like obviously learn it the part the best you can. You want to try and play your book as close as possible, but just know that these are some of the type of things you'll run into. So the music can be really simple, but it can get really really difficult. And so Can someone just say, can you see me or can you see just my screen?
I can personally see everything.
Okay, so you can see me. Okay.
Yeah,
Um,
both.
so these are kind of what the books look like. I have a few because I was supposed to do a couple shows um, the before the whole virus thing happened. But as you can see, these books are pretty thick. But they look mostly they're spiral. They're pretty simple and easy to read through. The one thing that I really like about these books is that most of them are pretty aware of good page turns. So you can't really see this here, but what's good, I don't know how easy it is to see, but it'll usually tell you at the bottom of the page if you have rests on the following page or if you have to play immediately when you turn the page and there's rests and things like that. So when it comes to page turns and things like that, the books are pretty good, but just know there's a lot of material there with the books. So that's just kind of what the books look like. And then like, here's another book too. So this is another show I was playing. So I don't know how well you can see, but you can see the difference in the size of the books. So that's why each show is completely different. So that's why you just have to go in with an open mind with the shows, because each one is just completely different. So important skills to play the music. I know I kind of went over some of these. Listening to the music beforehand is really, really important. Every time I go to a rehearsal, I'll put on the show that I'm going to play and I'll just listen through the songs just to listen to them as much as possible. Once you get the dialogue and if you can get some of the tempos in your head before and you kind of know what it sounds like, it's so much easier to play the music. Know that when you listen to the recordings, though, that a lot of the time those recordings are shortened. So I wouldn't say they're like so they're radio play friendly, but they're like things like the dance breaks and things like that that are visual usually get cut out of those recordings. So know that if don't like follow along with your book and think that it's going to be exactly what's on your page, because there might be like 2 pages of your book that's just completely cut from the cast recording. So just be kind of aware of that. But just listen to the songs as much as possible. As I promise, when you know the songs, it's a lot easier to play them, especially with all the tempo changes. And so that's why I would say the most important skill that'll get you asked back doing these musicals is if you watch, because there's a lot of tempo changes, there's a lot of cues, cutoffs, and there's a lot of cuts in the music too. So if a measure changes or they change speeds, you got to watch. So you always have to kind of have an eye on the conductor because the tempos change quite a bit. So that's a really important skill that kind of sets apart really great theater musicians, because the really fun part about these shows is that each show is a little bit different. The actors might do something a little bit different every show, or they might like some dialogue might take a little bit longer than usual depending on like if the audience is laughing, you might have to repeat things a few more times. So that's what I really love about these shows, is because even though you're doing the same show, it's each show is different every night, so it keeps you alert. You're not just kind of going into like a static mode. You're really paying attention the whole time, and it's a lot of fun. So that's why these shows are great. Sight reading is really, really important. And when I say sight reading, the note reading is very important, but going through and making sure, like I said, where you get any cutoffs, any key changes, really be familiar with those, because it's really easy, because a musical might just change keys on you and then one kind of wonky note stands out quite a bit. So really going through and making sure that you know where the piece is going and not remembering, but seeing where all the cuts are and things like that, that's really important too. And so that kind of goes on to my next point, which is remembering the cuts in the music. Always write down cuts and always make them easy to see. Don't assume you're going to remember cuts. Don't ever do that. Always write everything down in your book. So make sure that You write like where the cut is and where it is. And sometimes in my things, I'll just write giant arrows everywhere so I remember that there's a cut. Do whatever you have to do to remember the cuts, because those are really, really important, because if you don't, it can get sometimes easy to get lost. And then accidentals too. Don't assume you're going to remember the accidental that you keep getting wrong a couple times. I've done it where I think I'm going to remember them and I never do. So there's no shame in writing in the accidentals. It's your book. No one else sees your book. There's an easy accidental you have to write in, then just write it in. It's okay. It's better than playing the note wrong. So don't feel shame in writing in accidentals. And then be aware transposition is a possibility. Not frequently. It's more of a possibility if you do a youth show, because if you have an actor that has like a voice range that doesn't quite match their part, then you might have to change the key a little bit, but it's probably not going to happen every show, but it does happen occasionally. So just be prepared for that. But usually for the most part, conductors are pretty good about letting you know well beforehand if there's any sections that need to be transposed. But just know that is a possibility sometimes. And so are there any questions so far?
I have a question, a bit of a short question. So you've talked about Shrek the Musical and Legally Blonde, and then you've also talked about doing Little Shop, and they're very different. And Legally Blonde and Shrek the Musical are a lot more recent, obviously. Have you found that that a lot of the more recent shows are being performed more by high schools and community theater than a lot of the classic ones? Or that might be a hard question to answer, and yeah, it's just kind of a general question that popped into my head, because
No,
the styles must be very different.
Yeah, no, and that's a great question, because here's the thing too that to keep in mind with some of these schools, especially the high schools, is that a lot of it is that they need to sell tickets. So, for example, when you do Shrek the Musical, it might be a PG-13 show, but overall, you're kind of at a little bit of a target audience. Actually, let me give a better example. So, like a show like Little Mermaid. When my high school did Little Mermaid, they sold out all the tickets immediately, really far out, because it's a whole wide range. Where if you do a show that's geared towards older people, or you do a show that's not as familiar, like for example, after the year after I did Shrek, my high school did Thoroughly Modern Millie, which is a great show, but the generic person isn't going to know what Thoroughly Modern Millie is, where everyone knows what Shrek is. A lot of people know what Legally Blonde is. So that's why a lot of the time organizations kind of stick to the more popular ones, because they know they're going to get ticket sales. So to your question, I would say yes, people definitely are more aware of ticket sales now, because I know if you do anything that's related to a movie, those tickets are going to sell a lot faster than if it's kind of a lesser known. But there's still a lot of classics that still sell a lot, like shows like Footloose, West Side Story. There's a ton of other ones. There's so many musicals out there. Those definitely will be more popular. And another thing too that will be a consideration with the shows is the stage props and the amount of work it takes on stage. It's not even just the music. Shows like for example, Wicked on Broadway, I forget what the price is, but they spend, I think it's close to like $1,000 a night just on dry ice. So a lot of organizations, it's a lot of work depending on the show, how much stage items have to be built, how much backgrounds and things like that. So there's a lot of different things and considerations with those. So a lot of that's definitely a consideration. So that's why, to your question, I would say yes, because tickets are a lot easier to sell for a Disney musical than it is to sell for Thoroughly Modern Millie.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah. Awesome.
Did that
Thank
answer
you.
your question?
Yes. Thank you.
All right, of course. Are there any other questions?
I've got a question.
Yep.
So this past semester, actually, I was in the orchestra pit for Mamma Mia, which is a more contemporary one. It's the music of ABBA. And so we had 4 keyboards, 2 electric guitar players, electric bass, drum set, and then 2 auxiliary percussionists. And so I luckily had all of the equipment that I would have needed, amplifiers, and I have a problem buying guitar pedals. The other person that was with me actually borrowed my guitar pedals for like distortion, overdrive, fuzz, delay, because he didn't have any. And so what would you say is a good baseline of equipment that people should have going into these orchestra settings and these rehearsal settings? Because it wasn't made aware to me. I just happen to have had this stuff.
Right. Yeah, no, that's definitely a great question. I think there's a slide and a couple more where I go into that a little bit more, but just as a general rule, so like for instruments, so keyboards, I would make sure that you have your own keyboard. It really depends on the conductor too. Like I've done shows where they say, nope, I got main stage, I got a MIDI keyboard set up, just show up, I got the keyboard ready to go. Then there's some shows where they say you need to have your own keyboard and your own computer for main stage. So for keyboard players, definitely make sure you have your own computer and make sure that I would get main stage. At this point, if probably a little while ago, you probably didn't need it, but now it's pretty common that mostly everyone uses main stage. So for keyboard players, I would make sure you have that. And as a keyboard player too, I would also make sure you have an amplifier. Sometimes it's good to have, especially because with rehearsals where you're not in the theater, that's your only way of being amplified. You're not going through like the PA speakers yet. So that's important to have is pianists. And then guitarists have, like Andrew said, probably have your own amp. Make sure you have pedals. Have at least an acoustic and an electric. Occasionally shows might ask for like a 12 string or odd things like that. But usually if you have at least an acoustic and an electric, I've seen guitarists use up to 5 to 6 different guitars. Like when I did School of Rock, I mean, that guy had every old school guitar, rock guitar that you need for any type of genre. So it really depends on that. And then percussion is completely its own thing. Most people use their own kit, depending sometimes they might have you use an electronic kit. I wouldn't say it's an expectation to have your own electronic kit, but you might end up using an electronic kit. And mostly percussion, I would say you kind of coordinate with the conductor a little bit. Like I wouldn't, like usually it's like, do you have this? Do you want me to have that? Usually most conductors are kind of good about that, but just expect these are kind of like worst case scenarios that you have your own drum set and that you can bring that in and set that up. The drums especially can be tough to coordinate because you'll have some instruments going through the PAs, some of them not, and drums are really hard to balance with the rest of the band. So that's why expect to have your own drum set. And I would say some auxiliary percussion. I wouldn't say you need a complete, like everything we have in the back of the band room, but I would have at least some auxiliary. I'm not a percussion expert, but it seems like every show, the drums do something completely different. So just as a drummer, be prepared that you're going to have to be a little flexible on that. And then bass players, for the most part, make sure that you have your own amp and your own bass. I did a show once where someone only had a 5-string bass and they took the bottom string off and made it a 4-string bass because they were a guitar player borrowing their brother's 5-string bass. So I've seen that happen too. But bass players is the same as guitar. Just have your own setup, have your own amp. And it's also a lot easier running your own equipment than it is trying to run someone else's equipment, because I've seen people use like other people's equipment and it just like barely works. So that's something to keep track of. And then obviously reed players and everything kind of have their own saxophones and reed instruments, and brass is the same way. But with the rhythm section instruments, I would make sure that you have your own setup before, like you just expect to use your setup. And then if the conductor has some good options, then I would do it that way. And then in a couple slides, I'm going to go into some of the items that you should need for the pit that aren't including instruments. So Andrew, does that kind of answer your question?
Oh yeah, definitely. That totally did. I just also wanted to say you made me think of it when you brought up amplifiers. As a guitar player with a mostly jazz and rock background, I brought a Marshall stack to our first rehearsal, and I had to get a smaller amplifier. I luckily had a smaller practice amp that didn't sound as good, but also be aware of that in like a ensemble setting. I didn't need a 120-watt amplifier.
Yeah. No, and that's something I'm glad you brought that up too, because a lot of like bass and guitar players, they usually have a smaller amp. It's not super small, but it's not like a stack or anything. So be aware of the space too, because you might not have a lot of room. So those are things to be aware of. And usually, again, it depends on the setup, but prepared, you don't need a giant amplifier, but make sure it has a pretty good amount of sound. I don't know if there's any other people in here that have experience who are guitar or bass players that have like recommendations for amps, but I just know you don't want a Marshall stack, but you don't also want a practice amp. I mean, you want a Marshall stack for other things, but not the pit, unfortunately, where you're squeezed in with everyone else. But yeah, so that's something to keep in mind. Are there any other questions or comments? And I'm open to other comments too. I'm just kind of doing a brief overview. If you have like an expertise in your area, I'm happy for that input too. So the next slide I have is just how the numbering works. This is just kind of a short thing to help you navigate the book a little bit. So for the most part, big songs, like the big well-known songs, are going to be just a number. And any song that's like an interlude or kind of like a scene change or underscore, those are going to have the letters. So here's what like the cover of the Wicked book looks like. So obviously the opening, No One Mourns the Wicked, that's like kind of one of the bigger well-known songs. And then you look at like 2A is called like Elphaba's Entrance. That's just like background music when the person enters. It's probably only like 20 or 30 measures. So when you go through the book, just know if you come across just a number, that means it's probably a bigger song. And then all the letters usually mean smaller songs. So here, this is kind of going to go off of some of the past few questions. So items that you'll need for a pit: stand or stand light. So there's a couple different stands. I use the old school, I think it's called like a Manhasset, the giant like metal ones. Those are good. Sometimes there's another stand, I forget what it's called, but it's a smaller stand. You don't want a wire stand, but some of the smaller condensable stands are also good because it's just easier to move in and out. The Manhasset sometimes are kind of a pain because they're metal, so they don't bend or fold up or anything. In the stand light, I really recommend your own stand light. Sometimes conductors say that they have them. There's always things that can go wrong with the stand lights. You're not guaranteed light. The only way you might be able to see your music is by that stand light. So I recommend one that plugs in, because battery powered ones, if it dies midway through the show and you have no stand light and it's completely pitch dark and you can't see your music, that's something you probably don't want to have happen. So that's why I recommend one that plugs in. Just get one that plugs right into a power strip, and you won't have to worry about it going out or anything. There's a ton of different stand lights out there. They're all pretty much the same thing, like stand book lights. But those are that's something I recommend, is just get one that plugs in. And so the thing to plug it into is a power strip for electronic instruments. I bring my own power strip to everything just in case. So I have 4 or 5 outlets. So my keyboard, my amp, my stand light, charger for my computer, everything is right there. And I don't have to fight over any other outlets with anyone. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're a reed player, you probably don't have to deal with it as much. Usually you can bum off of someone else's power strip, but if you're an electronic instrument, definitely bring your own power strip. It will make you feel a lot better than some like fire hazard wire traveling 3 feet across the ground into a power strip across the room. And another thing too that's really important is guitarists and bassists, bring extra batteries for your guitar, because I did a show where someone's battery died halfway through the show and they didn't have a replacement battery. And we had to send the show director down the street to CVS to buy like a Duracell battery and run it out to us during the show and fix his battery. So have backups of everything, because if it has the chance to go wrong, it might go wrong. So just be prepared for anything, have backups of everything. And that's the same with reed players. Just make sure you have extra reeds, extra everything. I'm sure reed players already know that, because I've had many times where my reed just loves to not cooperate when I need it the most. So just have backups of everything. Don't assume that things are going to go perfectly. You got to prepare for the worst. Don't think it's going to be bad, because you're going to have fun. The shows are a lot of fun, but just be prepared as much as you can. In instrument stands, Hercules, as most instrumentalists know, is one of the best stands. Guitarists, if you have a ton of different guitars, just I shouldn't say make sure, but just bring your own guitar stand. Don't lay it across the seat and have some trumpet knock it over as they're walking by. Just have your own stand. And same thing with the reed players. If you have to play multiple instruments, getting a Hercules stand that can hold like 2 or 3 instruments is super helpful. Those are things to keep track of. You're probably not going to have the space to lay it down everywhere. So just kind of be aware of that. And depending on the setup, bring a pair of headphones. No matter what the conductor says, I would always bring a pair of headphones with a 1/4-inch jack. Sometimes you might use in-ear monitors, which is super cool. A lot of the groups I've been doing have gone to that, where instead of having a speaker, which a monitor, if you don't know, is basically just a speaker facing you so you can hear yourself. And instead of having speakers set up, a lot of groups are going to in-ear monitors where you wear headphones where you can hear yourself and other instruments in the pits or in the pit. So always bring a pair of headphones, because there's always that chance they might have in-ear monitor systems without telling you. And then, like we talked about earlier, amp for rhythm section, keyboard, be prepared just in case, because the speakers on your keyboard are probably not going to be loud enough. Even in like a rehearsal, just bring an amp, it's easier. I use a Roland amp. It's not giant. I forget how many watts it is, but you don't, like we talked about, you don't need to get a stack. Just an amp that has a pretty good amount of sound. And always, always, always bring a pencil. Always. There are going to be changes. There are going to be cuts. Always bring a pencil. And make sure, most pencils are okay. I'll go into this a little bit on the next page, but just try and write light, because you're going to have to erase your books at the end of the show. So don't write so dark to the point where you can't erase it after. Make sure you write light, or get like I think it's a number 3 pencil that's a little bit lighter. So bring those, but always bring a pencil. If you don't bring a pencil to a rehearsal, your memory is going to be put to the test. So just try your best to remember a pencil. And yeah, like I say at the bottom, just make sure you have backups of everything. So now here are the theater books do's and don'ts with your book, because these books are basically rented. So they're like, it's like renting a movie. So they go back to the theater company. So your book has to pretty much be returned how it was sent, or else the companies will get charged quite a bit. So just be aware that the rights and stuff for the shows are really expensive. So just be really careful with your book. Try and like keep it in good shape. Don't like let it get folded or bent and things like that. So the do's and don'ts. So pencil and eraser, don't ever use a pen. ever, 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 don't ever use a pen. Erase your book. So usually at the end of the show, everyone erases their books and turns them in. So be prepared. Bring an eraser too that has, don't use like the one on the end of your pencil because that's going to get torn up. Usually conductors will be nice and bring like, you know, in like elementary school, we all had that eraser that said like big eraser for big mistakes. That's like, bring something like that that you can erase throughout the book with. One thing I do that's a really good tip, if you have to erase your book by the end of the show, at the intermission, erase the first half. The intermission of the last show, I erase the first half of my book. So when the show and the run is actually done, I only have to do the second act and erase that. So you're not there for as long as you can focus on setting up. But just be prepared. You're going to have to erase your books because they have to be returned to the company, like pretty much blank, like you saw, like you got them. Write in the accidentals. Don't assume you're going to remember them because most likely you won't because there's 200 pages of music. Well, for keyboard players, there are. Write lightly because you want to make sure you're able to erase it and have the book the way it was. Write in the cues and stage dialogue when you can. Write in your books as much as you can. So if you have dialogue that comes in right before you play, write that in, or sometimes a certain word might be the downbeat. So write that in your music too, just as much cues and as much help as you can give yourself. That's always a good idea. Sticky notes are also good. I know we'll take like little Post-its and put that in our books with sections that we might have screwed up a little bit and then looked at that a little later. As if you try and remember where it is in the book, you're probably not going to find it. So those are just some of the basic do's and don'ts. Just kind of be aware of all of those and make sure that your book can just be restored back to its original shape as best as you can. So in the theater books, there's a lot of terms that people are usually have never seen before. So these are just some of the terms, just so you know. So a vamp is when you just keep repeating a section. So vamps usually will go under dialogue or under a scene thing. So if something's happening on stage, if it says vamp, you just keep repeating it over and over again until the conductor gives you a big cue to move on. So don't play the repeat once and then go on through. Just keep repeating it until you go on. And vamps are going to be different from time to time. Each show is a little different. So you might vamp it twice. You might vamp it 10 times. Whatever it is, just make sure that you vamp it and watch for those in your music. And then a safety is usually an optional vamp. It's usually there if you need it. So a safety is pretty much a vamp, but it's like most of the time you won't need it, but it's there for safety. And cuts, it's kind of as you assume what it means. Make sure you write it clear in your music. So like the books might have like 8 measures that you don't need for the dialogue. Like the dialogue might be going by faster than it is. You might just cut those 8 measures out and just keep going. So make sure that you write in the cuts really, really clear. Conductors usually go through this quite a bit, but that's probably the easiest way to get lost is if you miss a cut. So make sure that you're really clear with writing the cuts in your book. And then underscore is music that's played under dialogue. So that usually means people are talking on stage and you're just background music, kind of like almost a movie soundtrack. So 99% of the time, that's going to mean to play quiet. So make sure if you see underscore, that means that you're probably going to be playing quiet. So that isn't your time to rip your best trumpet solo or show off your range. Just kind of lay back and make sure that you can hear the actors on stage, because if you can't really hear them, then it might be tough for the audience. But usually most conductors are good about kind of signaling that to you. And then if you see dance break in your music, that means there's no singing on stage. It's just actors dancing and moving. So usually the pick can play out during that section. That's the time when trumpets can play like typical trumpet players and just play. Don't play super loud, but you can play out a little bit more because there's no dialogue. I know too in other places you can do it is in the entr'actes and the bows you can play louder because there's not really any dialogue. but you just want to be aware of the dialogue and not play too loud during those. And then continued overture is just the opening song in the musical. So basically what they have that for is like if you were to go to a real show on Broadway, people are just kind of like they're talking and getting food in the intermission. And once the overture or the entr'acte starts, that's kind of the signal like, hey, the show's starting, get in your seat. That's kind of the purpose those have. And the entr'acte is the same, but it's the start of Act 2. And then I think my pronunciation on these is bad as much as I've seen these. So I think it's just like surge or something in German. I haven't taken diction, so bear with me. When you see that in the end of your music or at the end of a song, that means just keep going on to the next song and don't stop. So just make sure you watch your conductors during that section. So when you see that, just make sure that you're prepared to play. You're not going to have like some couple-minute break or anything like that. Just be prepared to keep going. And then a reprise is a variation of an earlier song, and it's usually shorter than the original number, but it's still very similar to that. So it's kind of like a call and response. So it's like a response to an earlier song. So those are just kind of some of the terms. There's definitely a lot more, but those are the general ones that you really want to know, especially like vamp and safety and things like that, because a lot of the time you won't get those explained to you. So that's why just kind of keeping track of those is important. Does anyone have any questions so far about any of these things I've been going over? I know I'm just kind of spewing out information. All right, I'll keep going. So how to pick your theater gigs. So there's always a couple different things that I consider when it comes to these. Always ask for the schedule. Most conductors will want you for the dress rehearsal and the shows. Those are like a must. So if you plan on doing a musical, whatever you see the schedule, know that the dress and any of the shows are pretty much mandatory. Some of the rehearsals, it depends on the conductor. You might be able to miss like one, but for the most part, make sure that if they send out a schedule with all the rehearsals, that it works in your schedule. And know just with transportation that usually there's a rehearsal a week straight. So think about travel time. So for example, like for me, there's like if I were to do a show, say I were to do a show in Keene, for example, I live in Londonderry, New Hampshire. I live an hour and 15 minutes from Keene right now, unfortunately. But say I had to do a show where there were 4 rehearsals, 5 nights of tech, and 3 shows. So if I have to drive back and forth an hour and 15 minutes every single day, the amount of time with the driving and like the price of gas and all of that, it might not be worth it with the travel time. So it's not like a one-time gig or anything like that where you might have one rehearsal or one performance. You're going to have quite a bit of time to going back and forth. So just kind of be aware of that when planning out your things. You don't want to exhaust yourself too much just with the travel alone. And volunteer spots are absolutely okay. If someone comes along and says, oh, this musical doesn't pay anything, if it works in your schedule, I would do it anyway. Because there are so many great things. First of all, the more shows you can play, the better. Because if you play a show previously and that another theater group does it, then it's so much easier to get the gig when you say, oh yeah, I've played that show before, I know the book. That's less music, that's more shows you're able to do, and more people you get to meet. So even if you think, oh, it's like a volunteer thing, I'm not getting paid any money, don't not take the gig because of that. There's so many pluses to that. And the other thing that's good with volunteer spots is I was in an organization that did all volunteer spots for a long time. But when I started doing that, I met people, and that's the most important thing with these is meeting people, because I met people that do gigs at paying groups. So even though I was starting off not making any money, I started getting more and more gigs that pay. So don't think, oh, I'm not going to do this because it's free. Long term, it's going to provide you with more gigs. You're going to meet more people. and it always makes you look really great if you go in and you do a volunteer position and you do a really, really great job. And and there was a really, really great jazz presentation that Steve Cady did a couple weeks ago, and he talked about this thing which I was just like blown away by, and it just kind of made everything make sense for me. Was he talked about like a triangle for gigs. So it's like the people, the pay, and the music are like the three things. So if the people are really, really good and the pay might not be great, but the music is awesome, then you should do it. So don't let just the pay like veer you away from doing it. If the conductor, if you've heard it might not be the nicest pit to do, or it might not be great, then maybe it might not be the best thing, especially with transportation. But if the music looks good and they're going to treat you really well, I would 100% do it, because the more people you meet, the more gigs you're going to get. If you don't meet people, you're not going to get more gigs. That's just what it kind of comes down to. In most groups too, some of them, it might only be $100. If you get $100, I think that's really, really good. No matter how many rehearsals or anything like that, any pay is good. But again, like I've said, the more people you meet, the easier or the more things you'll get. And it's still a lot of fun. And the music skills that you get out of it are really, really important. And so how to get hired back: show up on time to rehearsals. For the first few, always get there early and just get the setup ready to go. I know my keyboard takes about 20 to 25 minutes to set everything up. I pre-test everything beforehand. I make sure main stage works. I make sure I got all the outlets, bring all the equipment. So show up early, because usually they probably want to start right on time. So you don't want to be delayed too much. So always show up early, especially for the first few, and show up on time. The conductors always like it when everyone's there ready to go. Learn the music. The goal with your book is to just play as much of it as possible. You should be able to think that you can play the entire book and there's no spots in it that you can't play. So learn as much music as you can. The conductors and everyone else in the pit can tell someone who's learned the book and someone who's not, and especially someone who's listened to the recordings and haven't. It's night and day. You can easily tell. And like I said, if you have instruments that have technology, test them before you arrive. Because I kind of think about these two is that, like, if they don't really know you're there, you're doing a good job. So if you show up, you just plug everything in and you just play, then you're doing a great job. If the conductor has to stop or everyone else has to like help you with all the technology stuff, it can be, I mean, it's not bad because like technology things are going to pop up, but if you can minimize that as much as possible, that's always good. And like I said here, bring everything that was on the items needed for the pit slide. Really, really important. Just bring everything. And have like I say, backups of everything. And always watch the conductor. You can tell there'll be times where you'll be able to tell someone's not watching the conductor and it really stands out. And even just watching it's just so important, and it makes the pit sound so much better. So just always watch and be a good person. This is probably the number one thing. If you're asked me what gets you asked back to gigs, being a good person, 100%. The best musicians that I've met in any of these pits or even anywhere, I would say, are the nicest people. And the reason they get all these things is because they're easy and good to work with. Because I know 100% that I'm not the best keyboard player or probably the best option for people. But since I go there, I show up on time, I'm good to work with, and you're nice to everyone, especially all the stage directors, all the stage managers, everyone there, the sound managers especially. If you can treat your whoever is running sound, if you treat them really, really well, that's huge. So treat everyone well, because running sound for musical is really, really hard. You're coordinating like 25 microphones in a 10 to 15 person pit. It's not an easy job. So if you can treat those people really well, they super appreciate that, and it's really remembered. So just know if you're a good person, you might not be the most talented musician ever, but if you're good to work with, they're probably going to want you back. So being a good person is huge. So that's something that I can't emphasize enough, because I think that that's the biggest thing that will get you asked back at these things. So that kind of wraps up everything I have. So just feel free to ask questions about anything or any comments about anything that I've gone over. I'm happy to answer them or hear what people have to say with like their experience or what they find works best.
This was super helpful. Thank you. I feel like I learned a lot with this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a comment and a question.
Yeah.
So like the comment, just like on what we were just talking about, like getting hired back, like that's all like super important also because a lot of music directors talk, like they know each other. And so if you do really well for one, like maybe you don't get paid, but it gets your name out there, they talk to each other. And so they'll like vet you with who you've played with before. So it's like really good to have that good relationship so that you get a good reference essentially.
Mhm.
And then my question is like, how early do you think that like music should get out?
Right. So that's a great question. So before I answer that, I just want to go back to the first point you have. And what Grant said is absolutely true. Um, Even before this whole virus hit, I did a show with someone and I got an email, and this guy was looking for a keyboard player. And he said, I recommend if you need a keyboard player, ask Jason. I added him to this email. He's great to work with. He does a great job with all the music and all of that. And so I've gotten plenty of things just because I've been a good person, and they will, because if they say, hey, I'm looking for a keyboard player, the music directors will say, oh, I need like a keyboard player, and they'll just recommend me to that, especially um, like a lot of the times too, when people are looking for someone, they'll say, I'm looking for a keyboard player, someone might say, oh, I really recommend this person, he's great to work with, and that might just get you that gig easily. And the other thing too with the volunteer positions is one conductor I work for, what she'll do is if you do a volunteer position, the first paying gig that pops up, she'll give it to you like immediately. So there's so many benefits to being a good person and having a good name in the community, because if you do all of those things, um, it helps you get the gigs. Just having a good image aside from your music ability, that's huge. And so to answer your question, a lot of people do it differently. um, I say if you do it with um, like younger students, I would say just get the books to them once you get them in the mail. A lot of theater groups will get them a couple months in advance because the actors need it. So as early as you can get younger students the books, I would just give it to them. A lot of the time the music is mailed to me. They'll just send it in a bubble mailer and I'll get it. Um, it really depends on the conductor. Sometimes I'll get the book 2 months in advance. I've had times where I've gotten it like a week in advance. There's been times where I show up to the first rehearsal and they just give me the book. But if I were to recommend sending out the music, I would just give it to people as early as possible, because the longer they have it, they definitely appreciate it than getting it like a week before. But expect that you might get it a week before. But if I were handing out the music, once you get the books, I would send them out as early as possible. And mailing's definitely a good way to get it to people.
I have some comments.
Yep.
A few things actually, just to go off of what you're just saying. I got the music for the last one I did earlier than everyone else because the pit that I was in, most of the people that were in the pit had been playing music for 30 plus years.
Mm-hmm.
And myself, freshman student, the conductor actually works at Keene, so he gave me the book as soon as he got it, but he gave everyone else it a little later because they were better at reading music than I am. And but the other thing I want to say was this like notion of playing for no pay. And when I took this volunteer, the Mamma Mia was a volunteer gig, and everyone was like, "Oh, you're gonna do all of that work for nothing." And it was like, one, it was just a great experience, and you never know what's going to happen, because it turned out the drummer of that orchestra pit was a guy that I took guitar lessons from, 15, 16 years ago. And he gave me a job at his music store. I haven't showed up for work because then a pandemic hit, but so it's like you might not be getting monetary value sometimes, but you're getting paid no matter what, and but there's also this funny thing in the guitar world, just speaking in guitar, for example. They were hesitant of getting guitar players because for some reason guitar players have a very bad rap of being flaky. I don't know why. It's like getting hired back notion that you were talking about. It's imperative that you're just impeccable with your word. You show up when you say you're going to show up, and if you're having trouble with something, talk to the conductor. That's infinitely better than just waiting till Friday night and being like, oh, I don't know how to play that. Yeah, this was super helpful, man. Thank you very much. You, with my limited experience, you really expanded on a lot of things that I had questions about that I never asked during the event that I was a part of. So that was really awesome. I also left something in your chat just for you.
Oh,
Very much.
Yeah,
Thank
of course. Yeah, because just to go off of that too, is like the person that I've been working on pits with for years. It's like she's a reference on my resume. I was applying to a job in her school district. Like, these people you meet, they help you such long term. And I will say, if you're a guitar player, it's weird. I don't know why, but I've done like musicals in the past where the guitar player, sometimes, like you said, is a little flaky. But I'm telling you, there's someone I know who's a guitar player, and he reads notation. He reads everything. I swear he's getting like every gig in the Southern New Hampshire area. He's playing every single weekend doing theater gigs, and he's making quite a bit of money. And it's just because he learns the music, shows up, reads it, and is reliable. And that's huge, so especially guitar players, if you can come in and you can read, especially notation, and you can, well, this kind of goes for everyone, but especially guitar, because there's a lot of times where a great guitar player, but they might not be able to read notation. They might only be able to read chords. So if you can read notation and you're reliable and you're good to work with, then your name will circulate really, really quick, and you'll start getting a lot of different things. So that's really important is guitar. It's a little different than the others because, like, for example, it's like keyboard's hard because most of the conductors play keyboard. There's keyboard players everywhere. It's a little harder to get your way through. But some of the other instruments, like if you're a reed player and you can play 4 or 5 different instruments really well, it's like I know a reed player. She's been on like the past 4 things I've done just because she's like the person everyone calls because they know she can play all the instruments. It's super important. So if you can make a really good name for yourself, it's really good. And then one more thing, kind of like your last comment, is I'm glad you got a lot out of this, because when you do a musical and if you've never done one before, a lot of those terms aren't really explained to you. It's not like the conductor sits down with a PowerPoint presentation and says, all right, when I do this, that means go on from the vamp. When I do that, it's like you're just kind of thrown into it. So that's why I'm glad that there's so many people that come to this, because I know for me, my conductor explained it a little bit, but I was really just thrown into it. I was a junior in high school playing Legally Blonde, just getting smoked by the music and how difficult it was, and keeping track of where I was and all the key changes and trying to keep track of the music. It's like, if you know all these terms going in, and another thing I didn't really emphasize in the thing, but the less questions you ask, the better. Like I say, if the conductor doesn't really know you're there, then you're doing a good job. Like if you can just follow everything you're doing, I'm not saying don't ask questions, but if you can just kind of follow along, then that's really helpful. I usually try to ask questions not in the middle of like a rehearsal, unless if he asks for questions. I usually try and ask them after and things like that. So when you're playing the music, just fitting in and being as close as you can to like a pre-recorded track to the conductor, that's infinitely helpful to the conductor. So that's an easy way to get asked back. But yeah, I'm glad it helped. And yeah, because I know a lot of these terms are just not really explained when you first do a musical. And like you said too, you know, I play shows with musicians where it's like they can sight read anything. So they don't even bother giving them the book. They just show up and give them the book and they just play it. So that's why you just have to be prepared for anything of how the conductor's going to treat you. Not that they'll treat you poorly, but they might just be like, oh, yeah, I'm sure he can just read the book, you know? So it's things like that to just be aware of. But overall, I feel like I haven't said it enough in this presentation, but like these are really fun. Like you really should play in a musical. The music's super fun. The being in the group is really exciting, and the crowds, like, and seeing how people react to the show, it's so much fun. Like anyone who's played in one will tell you how much fun it is to play the music. It really is a treat. So any other questions? I see some unmuted mics, which is exciting.
Jason, this is Deanna Zilski, and I'm here with Steve. First of all, I'm very lucky to have worked with Andrew in the last show that he worked in. Hi, Andrew. He was a great gift to the orchestra pit, so thank you. But I guess I'm coming from it as a director, and those people that are also listening that are future MDs of musicals. What would you recommend are kind of non-negotiables for those of us who MD shows and direct shows, for those who are playing in Broadway pits and orchestra pits? I think that would be really helpful for those of us, and people that go into music education are probably going to conduct at least one musical pit in their educational lives. So what would you recommend to us as to what we should provide for our pits every time we work with them?
Right, and that's a great question. Treat your musicians as best you can. So first of all, communication is huge. Get the dates to them as early as possible. Make sure the addresses are all correct. Make sure you give them clear instructions of where to go. Always be there, and make sure that you really get to know the musicians in the pit, because it's so much nicer when you play in the pit and your conductor like really treats you well and you feel like they treat you like a human. That's really important. And so providing things like I would always bring pencils. Like it's always nice if you just bring some mechanical pencils for everyone, bring erasers. I've never personally conducted a musical. I'm hoping to really soon because it looks really fun. So these are just things that I've noticed conductors doing in the past, but always helping your musicians set up, always just helping your musicians and being approachable and letting them ask questions is really, really important. And just overall being clear with them and just kind of giving them all of the information they need so it's easy for them and easy for you. A lot of that stuff that's amazing that makes great conductors has absolutely nothing to do with the music. It's like the human aspect of it. So yeah, that's what I would say is just always provide, just be really open to them. And then anything you can, if you have stand lights, always bring pairs of extra things too, because people might not think to bring like a pair of headphones or something like that. Always bring some extra cables, anything technology, bring extra power strips. Those are all really important. I always have like double backups of everything. So if you're running the music for a pit, just don't expect it like you don't think much in your musician, but just think about things that they might not remember, and just think about what things people appreciate like you doing. Like I always like it when I only have to make one trip to my car because someone carries my amp and stand while I carry the keyboard. Things like that. So the human part of being a conductor is really, really important. Does that kind of answer your question on that?
Absolutely, thank you. I hadn't thought about pencils. I know that sounds really silly because it seems like such a small thing, but it's easy to bring a box of pencils and have them available for the pit. So that's excellent. And I just want to reiterate your point about tempos, because sometimes the tempos that the MD or the director would like to set might be slightly alternate to a recording. So making sure that the pit gets those tempos in ample time to practice. So thank you for bringing that up. That's really important.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
I have a question.
Yeah.
That was it. I was thinking about it when Diana just was speaking. What do you, as a music director, what would you do, and how do you adapt to a situation or an emergency with night of the show, you know, piano one is sick, you know, he's in the hospital. How would you go about altering the music in order to have the show still go on?
Right. Yeah. And no, that's a great point, because I know a lot of that type of stuff does happen. Yeah, that's a good question, because I've never directed before, so there might be other people that have better ideas with that. But the worst thing you can do is like get mad at the situation. Like once you're mad, that kind of shows that you've lost control. I wouldn't say lost control of the pit, but you know, like things are going to pop up. So I would make sure, that's why if you really know the music, just try your best to keep it going. I know a lot of people, it happens all the time where you see posts like our keyboardist just got in a, like me, I got one gig last break because someone broke their wrist a week before the show and they had to bring me in. So it's like a ton of things like that happen. I don't know if there's anyone that has any experience with how to identify that, but that hasn't been something that I've really had to deal with personally, because I haven't led.
Yeah, well,
I would say, Deanna, just help me remember this. I think this is an example where being a good person pays off, because the answer, Andrew, is that the show will continue and you have to get somebody to sub for the chair. You can't not have that part in the pit. That's just not the way it goes in shows. So the example I have is that it wasn't a musical theater production, but we were doing a stage show at the Colonial this past February, and the pianist who was going to play with the jazz orchestra that night called me while I was at dinner, no joke, an hour before downbeat, an hour and a half before downbeat, and he wasn't going to make it. And so I called Jason Coburn, and Jason Coburn showed up and killed the gig, you know. So I think that's the answer.
awesome. So that just goes into what you're saying for the musicians of always having a backup.
Yeah, that's why another good thing with networking too, I know I didn't put this as much in my first answer, but that's why the more people you meet, like, because if I was available and I had a friend that was down a keyboard player, I know if you meet the right people and you're a good person, you would be willing to go sub to help them out. So meeting that is really important, but yeah, you have to do whatever you can to get a sub. There's just no like ways around that. So you just got to work your tail off to get a sub. Use Facebook. There's a lot of different Facebook groups too that you can help network through. That's more for the Boston area though, but just do anything you can to get a sub. But, you know, like Steve said, the show has to go on. But, you know, like I kind of said with the thing is that you just have to stay calm during it. And if things go wrong in the show too, or things aren't going great in the rehearsal, I'm telling you, it happens all the time, where there's always a time where like the conductor or someone running the show, like just kind of, I wouldn't say loses it, but you know, like I've seen it before where I've been in pits before where my director, and no one will have to deal with this or anything like that, but he would just start like yelling at musicians and getting like super mad. And it's like, what is that solving? You know, so even if you're frustrated, you know, you still have to be the good person and still go with the show and still hang in there, you know. So yeah, you got to just get the sub the best you can, and you got to just pretend like it's still the best pit you've ever been a part of. No matter how upset you are at the pit, you got to be nice to everyone, no matter what. So that's a really good question, because that happens all the time with the last minute subbing. And it is horrifying to sub, I will tell you. It's terrifying, especially like Steve talked about when I was when he asked me to play that thing, I was leaving dinner. You know, I was going back to relax and gets a call, can you be here in like 20 minutes, dressed up, ready to go at the Colonial, you know, and it was horrifying, but, you know, those are the things where, you know, you completely help someone out if you do that. So if you ever get asked to sub, if you're not available, just do anything you can, because the organization, they would really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Wow, nothing? All right, well, if anyone, here we go. I want to make sure I don't end this. There we go. So if anyone has any questions, definitely email me. I'm going to post this slideshow just as a reference, because I know I just spewed a ton of information at everyone, which I partially did on purpose, just because there's so much information. I mean, I could do an hour presentation on main stage. I could do an hour presentation on just like, I mean, there's so many different things you can do, but this is just kind of a quick overview of what to expect. So if you have any questions, email me. There's also great people like Steve is also a great person to talk to about all these things. You know, most people have played in them, most educators, so they're definitely good. It's definitely good to talk to all of them. So yeah, so I appreciate you all coming. Thank you so much. And if you ever get asked to do one, please play in it. It's so much fun. It's by far my favorite gig to do. So don't turn it down. Do it, because it makes you a better musician, a better person, and they're a lot of fun. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming in. Good luck with finals next week. And it's sad not seeing all of you. So I hope to see all of you soon. So thank you.
Great job, Jason. That was wonderful.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that.
I second.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, everyone.
See you guys.
Good job
Have a good night.
graduating.
Thank you for the clapping emojis. All right, have a good night, everyone. Thank you.